The United States and China were engaged in a game of cat and mouse in the South China Sea on Tuesday when all of a sudden China fired on an American stealth bomber. But just seconds later, that Chinese missile base was completely erased by another U.S. warplane. Here's what happened and why everyone is now bracing for World War III. China targeted the U.S. at first light. The People's Liberation Army Air Force launched multiple fighter jets to intercept two B-2 Spirits over the South China Sea on Tuesday. The PLAF flew multiple J-10 and J-16 fighter jets to intercept the bombers just after 4 a.m. local time. One report indicates that it may have been a case of mistaken identity, but Beijing has not denied the incident, nor has it said whether the fighters opened fire. Now, given the fact that China would not normally be flying fighter jets at such an early hour, especially not in the South China Sea where there are no disputed territories, many suspect that this was no accident. And if that is true, then this represents a major escalation in hostilities between the two superpowers. However, according to the Pentagon, the B-2 responded appropriately and safely. One source said that the B-2 either made a sharp turn or performed some other evasive maneuver to avoid the Chinese interceptors. If that is true, then that means that China's response failed to force the B-2 out of the area and thus their plan failed. However, another report claims that the B-2 turned around and headed back to its base in Guam. So it is unclear exactly how the situation unfolded. Now, if the B-2 did perform an evasive maneuver to avoid the incoming missiles, then that shows just how dangerous this situation really was, because that would mean that the B-2 was likely flying inside of Chinese airspace, which would constitute a massive breach of sovereignty. And even more concerningly, it would mean that China's air defense systems are severely lacking in capability and control, because the B-2 is widely regarded as the best stealth aircraft currently in service anywhere in the world. In fact, it is arguably the most advanced aircraft in history. And if China was unable to stop this bomber, then that could be very bad news for Beijing. However, if the B-2 did head back to Guam, then that could point to a few different things. It could mean that the B-2 decided to simply leave the area, but it could also mean that the B-2 evaded the initial barrage of missiles and then struck back before the Chinese fighters could respond. In fact, if that is what happened, then it would represent a huge embarrassment for China. It would show that their air defense systems are so inferior that the U.S. can fly a bomber right into their airspace without warning and then destroy their entire missile infrastructure before they can even respond. And that is exactly what happened. Just hours after the alleged attack on the B-2, a U.S. Navy F-35C took off from the aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan and struck a Chinese missile base on Hainan Island with a single conventional air-launched JDAM. The missile base is believed to have been responsible for launching the missiles that targeted the B-2 earlier in the morning. Now, this is significant because it demonstrates that the United States has immediate access to critical intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets in the region. In other words, the U.S. was able to launch a surgical strike within hours of the Chinese attack, which showcases the incredible speed and accuracy of America's naval aviation assets. But this is also significant because the strike destroyed an important part of China's military infrastructure. We know that China deployed multiple missile launchers to intercept the B-2, but we don't know exactly what type of missiles they used. However, we do know that the Chinese missile base on Hainan Island was completely destroyed, which means that Beijing cannot use this base to launch attacks against the United States or its allies. This is a big deal because this base was one of China's most important missile bases in the region. It was responsible for defending against incoming aircraft and missiles, and it was also used to launch offensive strikes into the South China Sea. By destroying this base, the U.S. has significantly weakened China's military posture in the region. And that is not going to sit well with Beijing. They will likely respond with more military exercises and saber rattling. But they will be hesitant to engage in any sort of direct military conflict with the United States because they know that they cannot win a war against the U.S. Navy. In fact, China knows that the U.S. Navy is too powerful to be challenged militarily. And that is why China has resorted to building artificial islands and military installations in the South China Sea. China wants to be able to project power in the region without having to face the wrath of the U.S. Navy. But now, even that option is no longer available to them. The U.S. Navy can travel anywhere it wants in the South China Sea and strike targets with impunity. China has effectively been neutered, and this is going to cause major headaches for Beijing. They need to figure out how to defend their territory and assets in the region without relying on long-range missiles. And that is going to be very difficult to do. China is going to have to rely on shorter-range, lower-cost defense systems which are not nearly as effective. This is going to put a huge strain on China's military budget, and it is going to make it much more difficult for them to compete with the United States militarily. But while the United States has come out on top in this particular incident, there are still a lot of questions that remain. For example, was this premeditated or was it a defensive reaction? If this was premeditated, then that raises some serious concerns about China's intentions. Why would they want to provoke the United States in this way? And if this was a defensive reaction, then why didn't China's air defense systems detect the B-2 sooner? These are important questions that need to be answered because they will help us better understand the intentions of both countries. This incident is a clear indication that tensions between the United States and China are at a boiling point. The South China Sea has been a major flashpoint for some time now, and it is clear that both countries are willing to risk war in order to achieve their goals in the region. The United States wants to maintain freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and China wants to assert its sovereignty over the region. So far, China has been winning this battle, but this incident could be a turning point. The United States has shown that it is willing to take risks to protect its interests in the region, and China may soon regret challenging America's dominance in the South China Sea. Now, the global community is closely watching this situation develop. This incident has already caused tensions to spike around the world, and any further escalation could lead to a wider conflict. The United States and China are two of the most powerful countries in the world, and a conflict between them would have devastating consequences. That is why it is so important that both sides exercise restraint and avoid any further escalation. As we look ahead, it is clear that the relationship between the United States and China will continue to deteriorate. Both sides have fundamental differences that cannot be ignored, and competition between them will only intensify in the years to come. This incident is just the latest example of this trend, and it serves as a reminder that the world is becoming a more dangerous place. As tensions rise, we can expect to see more close calls and incidents between the two superpowers. It is crucial that both sides exercise caution and seek peaceful resolutions to their differences. A mistake or miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences for the entire world. Now, let me ask you, do you think that this was a planned attack by China, or was it a defensive reaction to the B-2 entering Chinese airspace? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, make sure to stay tuned for more updates. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed the video. Now, I have another question for you. Do you think that this event will lead to World War III, or do you think that both sides will be able to de-escalate the situation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.